Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is as you press play, we're honored to keep you company as you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the stillness around you, and the space you've made to simply let go. If you enjoy this experience, we invite you to subscribe to the Sleep Library. We create gentle, slow, and calming stories to help you sleep. Stories you won't hear anywhere else. And in the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Your words help us build a global, restful little community. One quiet listener at a time. Now, if you're ready, let's travel back to a time not often remembered, to a village where the wind listened and whispered back. It is the 3rd day of January, 1894, and the wind has not rested since Christmas night. I sit in the lantern room now, the great lamp warm beside me, watching the snow drift across the sea like torn paper. The glass of the lantern is rimmed with frost, and when I breathe too close, my breath fogs the view until I wipe it away with my sleeve. The sea tonight is not its usual deep black, but a strange, silvery gray, the kind that catches the light of the moon through the storm clouds and seems to glow from within. I have been alone here for 13 days, though the gulls that circle above the rocks sometimes feel like company. The supply boat was meant to arrive 3 days ago, but the storms have closed the waters, and even the hardiest captains know better than to challenge the winter currents around this headland. In the kitchen below there is still bread, though it is hard as driftwood now, and a small wheel of cheese I am saving for the day the sea finally grows. Quiet. The stove burns coal sparingly, and I sit wrapped in a blanket that smells faintly of the tarred rope stored in the sheds. I keep my journal by the lamp, riding by its steady glow, and when my eyes grow tired, I walk the circular room, feeling the boards creak gently under my feet. Outside, the snow moves like a living thing, curling and diving between the jagged rocks, trying to find its way into every crack in the tower. Sometimes when the wind leans against the glass, the whole lantern hums, a low and steady note that I have grown to think of as the voice of the sea itself. I remember my first winter here, the fear that came. When the supply boat did not appear, the silence that seemed to press in from every wall. Now I find the silence a companion. There is no clock loud enough to argue with the wind. No footsteps except my own. Time here is measured only by the turning of the lamp, the sweep of its beam across the water, and the moments when the seabirds call. I imagine the village beyond the headland, buried under snow, its chimneys breathing smoke into the frozen sky, the narrow streets hushed by the drift. I wonder if anyone there thinks of the keeper tonight, high above the sea, watching for ships that will not come. My pen scratches slower now. The ink has grown thick in the cold. I close this first letter with the sound of the waves below, steady, patient, and endless, as they have been long before this tower was built, and will be long after my watch here is done. It is the 7th day of January, and the snow has deepened so much that the narrow path down to the boathouse is hidden entirely, swallowed under a smooth white sheet that glows faintly in the lantern light. I tried to clear it this morning, but each step sank so far that my boots filled with snow, and by the time I reached the halfway mark, the wind had already drifted. It closed behind me. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cold, watching the waves crash against the black teeth of the rocks. The sound here is not like in the calmer seasons. It is sharper, faster, as though the sea is impatient with the land and keeps testing its edges, hoping to take more. The gulls have vanished, replaced by the low shadows of cormorants that skim the water like pieces of night torn loose. Inside the tower, I keep a small fire going in the stove, but the rooms away from its heat grow colder each day, and frost now gathers on the inside of the windows like lace. At night, when I descend from the lantern room to sleep in my narrow bed, I can see my breath cloud the air above my blanket. I dream more vividly in this weather, perhaps because the isolation seeps into my mind, or perhaps because the sea whispers to me in my sleep. Last night I dreamed of a ship, not one I have ever seen, its sails stiff with frost, its crew moving silently on the deck, their faces pale and unreadable. They passed the headland without a sound, and though I lit the lamp and waved my lantern toward them, they gave no sign they had seen me. When I awoke, the dream clung to me like wet clothes. I went to the gallery outside the lantern room and leaned out into the dark, but there was nothing but the hiss of the snow and the steady breath of the waves. I have begun speaking aloud to myself more often now, narrating my tasks in the way I once did when training new keepers years ago. Trim the wick, check the lens, watch the horizon. The words are a comfort, a reminder that I am still here, still doing the work that needs to be done. On the desk beside me rests a tin box filled with letters I have never sent, small accounts of winters past, ships rescued, days when the sea lay flat as glass. Perhaps when the ice breaks and the supply boat comes again, I will send them all at once, or perhaps I will keep them here as part of the lighthouse, each word a grain of sand in its long memory. Tonight, the lamp turns, the snow falls, and the sea speaks in its deep, unhurried tongue. I will write again when the weather changes, though I suspect it may be some time before it does. It is the 11th day of January, and the wind has begun to sound different, not quieter, exactly, but deeper, as though it is pulling itself from somewhere far below the horizon. This morning, I woke to a steady moan around the base of the tower, a hollow, unbroken tone that made the walls feel as if they were breathing. I dressed quickly and climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, each step colder than the last, until my hands ached on the iron railing. The storm had not eased. Snow still moved across the water like drifting smoke, and the sea boiled white around the rocks. But in the far distance, I thought I saw something, a dark line against the gray, moving slowly along the horizon. I kept the lamp burning at full strength and watched for nearly an hour, but whatever it was dissolved into the mist without drawing closer. Perhaps a ship, perhaps only a shadow where the water met the sky. In the afternoon, I ventured outside to check the storage shed. The snow was waist-high in places, and I had to lean my whole weight against the shed door to force it open. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of rope tar and the faint sweetness of old wood. I found the oil drum still sealed, the extra wicks dry, the lantern glass uncracked. These small certainties are comforting. In weather like this, one broken lens could mean the difference between light and darkness for the ships that pass here. Back in the tower, I warmed my hands over the stove, then sat to repair a thick wool sweater whose cuffs had frayed. I worked slowly, in long, even stitches, listening to the sounds of the place. The tower has its own language, the sigh of the wind in the upper vents, the creak of the stairs when the temperature drops, the distant, muffled heartbeat of the waves below. Sometimes I imagine the stone itself is aware of me, keeping me company in its own way, steady and patient. Tonight, the clouds have thinned just enough for the moon to show itself pale and round, casting a faint silver path across the waves. I find myself wondering about the keepers who came before me, men and women whose names I know only from the faded entries in the logbook. Did they sit here as I do, wrapped in blankets, watching the same restless sea? Did they feel the same strange comfort in the solitude, or did they count the days until they could leave? I close this entry with the lamp's light sweeping once more across the black water, a reminder that even in the loneliest places here is work to be done, and in the doing of it there is a kind of peace. It is the 15th day of January, and the cold has settled in like a tenant who has no intention of leaving. Every surface in the tower holds. The memory of the frost, the iron of the staircase biting through my gloves, the wooden banisters smooth and chilled, the stone walls breathing out a cold that lingers long after the fire is gone. This morning I woke before the first light and lay still beneath my blanket, listening. There is a quiet that comes only in the hours before dawn, when the wind pauses for breath and the sea shifts into a slower rhythm, as if the world is caught between one heartbeat and the next. I rose in that stillness, dressed, and climbed to the lantern room without lighting my lamp. The snow reflected enough of the moon's glow to guide my steps, and when I reached the top, I stood there in the dimness looking out at a world almost entirely without color, just shades of gray silver and black. The beam from the lamp cut a slow, patient arc across the water, and in its path I thought I saw movement far below, along the shoreline. I pressed my forehead to the glass, trying to focus, but the shapes were indistinct, perhaps driftwood washed in by the tide, perhaps a seal moving awkwardly over the rock's dot. In truth, it could have been anything, and in weather like this, the mind often paints its own pictures. I went out onto the gallery to breathe the air, sharp and heavy with salt. From there, I could hear the deeper swells out beyond the shallows, the sound of the sea folding in on itself and then rushing forward again. The horizon was blurred by a curtain of snow, and somewhere beyond it, the rest of the world carried on, unaware of this solitary figure keeping watch at the edge of the land dot inside. I set water to boil for tea, the kettle singing softly in the stillness. I sat by the small window in the kitchen, hands wrapped around the warm cup, watching the flakes drift and spin in the glow from the lantern above. I thought of a letter my predecessor had left in the desk drawer, written nearly 20 years ago, describing a winter much like this one. "The days grow short," he wrote, "and the nights longer still. But the lamp must turn and the keeper must keep." I find comfort in knowing that others have sat here through the same storms, the same long silences. The logs are full of their words, and now mine will join them, another voice in the unbroken chain of watchers dot. As night falls, I hear the wind returning, building its low, steady song around the tower. I trim the wick, polish the lens, and let the light go out into the dark. Somewhere, perhaps a ship will see it and know there is someone here, awake, holding the course steady. It is the 19th day of January, and the storm has returned in earnest. The wind arrived just after midnight, not as a sudden roar, but as a low, creeping force, like a hand turning the latch of a door dot. By the time I climbed to the lantern room for the first watch, the tower was shuddering with each gust, the beams overhead whispering with the strain. Snowflakes hurled themselves against the glass in quick, furious bursts, melting only to leave long silver trails that caught the lantern's glow before vanishing. I kept the wick high tonight, the flame steady and full, for the sea below is the sort that swallows ships whole without a trace. Through the glass, I could see the breakers smashing themselves against the outer rocks, spraying white foam high into the black air, where it froze almost instantly into drifting shards. The horizon is gone, erased by darkness and the swirling snow, so that the world feels smaller. Only the circle of light around this tower, and beyond it a void. I paced the lantern room to keep warm, the sound of my boots dull on the boards. Between circuits, I stood with my hands against the glass, scanning for any flicker of light, any movement that might mean a vessel caught in this weather dot. It is strange how quickly the mind begins to shape the shadows. One moment a simple wave crest, the next the outline of a ship's prow, imagined but convincing. At dawn there was no sign of anything beyond the endless sea. I descended to the kitchen and warmed a pot of porridge, eating it slowly while the stove creaked and popped in the heat. The smell of coal smoke mingled with the salt dampness that seeps into everything here. After breakfast, I made my way down to the base of the tower to check the door. The snow had piled nearly to the latch, and I had to push hard to open it against the drift. The air outside was bitter enough to sting the inside of my nose, and I stayed only long enough to clear the path to the oil shed before retreating back into the tower as relative warmth. Now, as I write this by lamplight, the wind is still working its way around every seam of the stone, a patient, endless motion. There is a comfort in the routine, trimming the wick, winding the mechanism, checking the journals, tasks that have been done in this place for decades without pause. I imagine each keeper before me moving through these same rooms, their steps worn into the grain of the floorboards, their voices absorbed into the walls. We are all part of the same long watch, bound not by time but by duty, and in that there is a strange and steady peace. It is the 24th day of January, and the sea has turned the color of slate, a heavy, unyielding gray that seems to drink in what little light the day offers. The storm has passed for now, leaving a stillness that feels almost unnatural after so many nights of relentless wind. This morning, I woke to the sound of silence. No rattling windows, no moan of the vents, no hiss of snow against the glass. It was as if the world itself had stopped to catch its breath. I climbed to the lantern room and found the horizon drawn sharp and clear, the far edge of the sea a clean line against a pale winter sky. The water was calmer than I had seen it in weeks, though the swell still rose and fell with a slow, heavy rhythm as if the ocean were not yet ready to forgive the land for standing in its way. From the gallery outside, I watched the tide pulling back, revealing dark, glistening rocks streaked with white salt and patches of frozen sea spray. The gulls had returned, their cries sharp in the still air, and for a moment I imagined they were as relieved as I was for this break in the weather. After my watch, I went down to the storage room to take stock of supplies. The bread is gone now, and I have taken to baking small loaves from the flour that remains. Their crusts hard but satisfying in the quiet hours of the night. The cheese wheel is nearly finished, though I have saved a final wedge for the next storm, a small comfort to look forward to. In the afternoon, I took the long rope ladder down to the lower rocks to clear a cluster of seaweed that had tangled near the mooring posts. The cold bit through my gloves as I worked, the wet knots stubborn and slick. From that vantage point, I could look up at the tower rising sheer above me, its stone dark against the light sky, the lantern's glass catching the sun like a watchful eye. I thought then about how small we keepers are compared to the work we do, how little of the world will remember us, and yet how vital our presence is in the moment. When the sun began to set, the sky deepened into a pale wash of gold and lavender, the kind of light that makes the sea seem endless and full of secrets. I lit the lamp early tonight, letting its beams sweep out across the water in slow, deliberate arcs. Somewhere out there, perhaps a ship is cutting through the calm, its crew seeing the glow and knowing they are not alone on the water dot as I write this. The first stars are beginning to appear, faint pinpricks against the fading sky, and the quiet is so deep that I can hear the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen below dot. It is a rare gift, this kind of stillness, and I mean to keep it close while it lasts, for the sea always remembers to take back its calm. It is the 29th day of January, and the calm has ended as I knew it would. The first sign came yesterday evening, a faint darkening on the horizon, as if the sky had been smudged with coal dust dot. By nightfall, the smudge had spread, and the wind began to find its voice again, low at first, like a whisper in the walls, then stronger, more insistent, until the lantern panes trembled in their frames. By dawn, the sea was in full revolt. I stood at the window of the lantern room, looking down at the waves as they hurled themselves at the base of the tower, each one exploding into a burst of white spray that froze mid-air before drifting back to the rock's dot. The horizon had vanished completely, swallowed by snow and mist, and the light from the lamp seemed to hang in the air only a short distance before being devoured by the storm. I kept the wick high through the night and into the morning, knowing that even a faint shadow in this weather could be a ship's salvation. The cold is harsher now than it was earlier in the month, the kind that works its way into your bones and refuses to leave dot. My gloves are stiff from the damp, and even in the kitchen the air bites at the edges of my fingers. I burn more coal now, though I know I must ration it. The storage ledger tells me I have enough to last another month if I am careful. But winter is a thing that likes to linger here, and I will not tempt it by being careless. The sea today has a strange tone, a deep, almost metallic groan beneath the crash of the waves, as if the water is striking some great hollow drum hidden beneath the surface. The sound comes up through the stone of the tower, vibrating faintly through the soles of my boots. I think of the sailors out there in the dark, steering by instinct and memory, searching for the sweep of this lamp. I wonder if any of them have seen it yet, a bright thread in the black cloth of the night. In quieter moments, I pace the lantern room to keep warm, my breath clouding the glass as I pass. Outside, the snow moves like smoke over the sea, hiding and revealing the rocks in a slow, endless rhythm dot. It is strange, but in storms like this, time seems to loosen its grip. Hours blur into each other, marked only by the turning of the lamp and the occasional creak of the tower as it shifts against the wind. Tonight will be another long watch, but I do not mind. There is a kind of companionship in the work, the lamp, the sea, the storm, and me, all bound together in the simple agreement that the light must not go out. It is the 3rd day of February, and the storm has reached a ferocity I have not seen in years. From the lantern room, the world beyond, the glass is a blur of white and black snow twisting through the air in wild spirals as the waves crash against the outer rocks with a violence that shakes the stone beneath my feet. The sound is relentless. Not only the crash of water, but the deep, guttural roar that comes from somewhere beneath the surface, as though the sea itself is groaning in frustration at being held back. The glass of the lantern sweats with condensation, and every so often I must wipe it clear with a cloth to keep the beam clean. Even so, the light is swallowed quickly by the blizzard, its reach shortened to a faint glowing haze just beyond the tower. I pace the room to keep warm, pausing only to check the mechanism, trim the wick, and scan the invisible horizon for the faintest sign of movement. It is hard not to imagine shapes in this kind of weather. The sudden flicker that might be a sail, the shadow and the snow that could be a hull. The mind, starved for company, will invent anything to fill the empty expanse. I descended earlier to the storeroom to fetch another sack of coal, my boots slipping on the frozen steps. The air down there was colder than outside, thick with the scent of damp rope and the faint tang of salt that never leaves the stone. I loaded the stove with a generous handful, letting the warmth push back the edge of the chill that creeps in from the walls. While it burned, I stood by the small kitchen window and looked out at the snow streaking sideways across the sky, moving so fast it seemed the wind was trying to carry the whole world away. My hands ached from the cold, even through the gloves, and when I remove them, my fingers are pale and slow to bend. Still, there is a satisfaction in the constancy of the work. Every hour, I return to the lantern room, tend the flame, and send its light into the void. The sea may rage and the snow may blind, but the lamp stands steady, and so do I. In the rare moments when the wind dips low enough for me to hear the water directly, I imagine the sound as the breathing of some great creature sleeping fitfully beneath the waves. Out there, ships may be struggling toward safe waters, and though I cannot see them, I know my light may be the only promise they have of a safe shore. Tonight, I will keep the watch through until morning, the storm and I locked in our silent, endless agreement. It will try to hide the world, and I will keep lighting it anyway. It is the 6th day of February, and today, for a fleeting moment, the storm broke. I rose early, more out of habit than hope, and when I stepped into the lantern room, I was struck by the strange quiet. The air was still, the sky a pale and hollow blue, and the sea, though still restless, had drawn back its fury. The horizon was visible once more, crisp and distant, and I stood there, staring at it as if it were a long-lost friend returned. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, covering the paths and rooftops like a clean white sheet pulled over a tired body. The rocks below the tower gleamed with frozen salt, and for the first time in weeks I heard the soft flap of wings as gulls returned to circle overhead, calling out to one another in the strange language only birds and wind seemed to share. I took the moment to step outside onto the gallery. The air was bitingly cold, but without the wind it was bearable. I stood at the railing, both hands resting on the iron, and took in the vastness of the sea. It is easy to forget how beautiful this place can be when you are sealed away inside with only the storm for company. There was no ship in sight, no smoke on the horizon, no sign of life beyond the gulls, just the sea, the sky, and the tower. I went back inside and boiled water for tea, watching the steam curl and rise in the golden morning light that filtered in through the narrow kitchen window. It reminded me of mornings long ago, before I was assigned to this place, when the world felt closer, when silence was rare and sleep came easily. Those days feel like a different life entirely, one I can visit only in brief memories. After breakfast, I took the time to go through the old logbooks again. Some date back more than 60 years, filled with neat handwriting from long-forgotten keepers. They speak of storms and supply shortages, but also of lonely birthdays, sightings of whales near the shoals, and once, a poem scrawled in the margins in faded ink. If I should vanish with the tide, tell the wind I tried to stay. I don't know who wrote it, but I read it aloud, quietly, as if the tower itself might remember the voice. I've begun to feel as though this place remembers everything, every footstep, every breath, every name whispered into the dark. The lighthouse is not just a building. It is a witness. And tonight, as I light the lamp once again and send its beam out into the darkening sea, I feel that witness within me, patient and silent and steady. The storm will return. I can feel it waiting in the wind, but for now I will sit with the calm and let it warm the cold corners of my mind. It is the 10th day of February, and the sea has resumed its slow, steady unrest. The calm of the past few days has been replaced by a rolling swell, the kind that moves with the weight of something ancient and unhurried. From the lantern room, I watch the horizon shift and tilt, the water carrying long, heavy waves that rise like the shoulders of giants before collapsing into themselves with a sigh. The wind has returned, but it is no longer the shriek of winter's fury. Instead, it hums low through the vents, weaving around the tower in a tune so constant it feels almost like breathing. I find myself matching its rhythm without thinking. Footsteps, The turning of the crank, the brush against the glass, all falling into the same quiet tempo. This morning, I climbed down to the rocks during low tide, bundled against the cold. The air was thick with the scent of brine and kelp, and the stones were slick beneath my boots. I walked along the edge where the sea met the land, watching the foam pull back and leave trails in the sand like ghostly handwriting. Here and there I found fragments, bits of rope, a broken piece of wood with faded paint, a glass bottle half buried and filled with frozen seawater. I took the bottle back with me, wondering if it had carried a message once, now long erased by time and tide, dot by afternoon. The clouds had gathered again, blotting out the pale sun, and the air took on that strange heaviness that always comes before snow. Sat at the small desk in the kitchen and opened the oldest of the log books, running my fingers over the brittle paper. One entry caught my attention, dated almost exactly 50 years ago. The keeper wrote of a night when a single light appeared offshore, unmoving for hours. At dawn the light was gone, and no vessel was ever reported in the area. He wrote, "Some lights guide you home. Others watch you." The words sat with me for the rest of the day, clinging like the scent of smoke to fabric. Now, as I write this, night has fallen, and the first snowflakes drift lazily past the glass. The lamp's beam cuts through them, catching each flake for the briefest moment before it vanishes back into the dark. I can hear the sea, steady and patient, and somewhere in the distance, the muffled call of a gull who has lost its way. There is an intimacy to nights like this, the kind that makes the world feel very small, the edges blurred, the horizon forgotten. The tower and I are alone in the dark. And yet, in this isolation, I feel more a part of the world than I ever did in the noise of the mainland. It is the 14th day of February, and the wind has been relentless since before dawn. It rattles every seam of the tower, slides through the smallest cracks, and hums in the lantern-room glass like a bow drawn across a violin string. The sea is a churning expanse of iron gray, flecked with white where the waves hurl themselves into the air. I have been at my watch for hours now, pacing slow circles, pausing to wipe the condensation from the lens, trimming the wick so the flame burns clean and strong. My gloves are damp from the constant touch of cold glass and metal, but I dare not remove them for long. Earlier this morning, I ventured down to the storeroom to count supplies again. The flour sack is lighter than I'd like, and the coal bin is half empty. Winter is far from over here, and I must make the fire last. Outside. The air smells of salt and snow, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose when I step onto the gallery. I stayed out only long enough to see that the sea ice is creeping closer to the rocks, a slow and silent advance that comes each year when the cold tightens its grip. The gulls are gone today. replaced by the cry of a lone cormorant struggling against the wind, its wings beating hard in the thin light. I think often of the keepers who stood here before me, tending the lamp through storms like this one, their faces turned toward the horizon in the same unbroken vigil. There is a comfort in knowing the work has been the same for 100 years. Wind, sea, lamp, watch, the pattern unchanging, even as the world beyond moves on dot. As night falls, the storm deepens. Snow sweeps sideways across the glass, and the sea below has become a black, shifting void. I can see nothing beyond the light's reach, but still I keep the lamp turning, because somewhere out there in the dark there may be someone searching for it. The thought keeps me awake, keeps my hand steady as I wind the mechanism again, listening to its quiet tick, the heartbeat of the tower, and knowing that for as long as I am here, the light will never falter. It is the 18th day of February, and the sea has been locked in a restless argument with the wind since yesterday afternoon, a ceaseless back and forth that rattles the lantern panes and shakes the iron railing outside like the bones of some great beast caught in the cold. From the moment I woke, the air was filled with the deep, low roar of water breaking over the rocks and the thin, high whistle of the gale forcing itself through every crack and seam in the tower's stone. The sound is constant, so steady that after a few hours it becomes less like noise and more like a strange kind of music, a single endless chord struck by nature itself. The light has been my only company all day, the soft mechanical click of the turning mechanism, the faint hiss of the flame when I trim the wick, the quiet knock of my boots against the boards as I pace. I went down to the kitchen this morning to make tea, but the water boiled slowly, as if the cold had reached even into the kettle. When I poured it, the steam rose sluggishly, curling into the air before vanishing against the chill. I sat for a long time at the small table, hands wrapped around the cup, watching the frost gather in delicate veins across the edges of the window-pane dot. By midday, I decided to check the supply shed, though I dreaded stepping into the wind. The door resisted me at first, snow piled high against it, and when I finally forced it open, the cold rushed in like a living thing. Outside, the world was unrecognizable. The paths I had cleared last week were gone, replaced by an unbroken field of white, the drifts rising high enough to swallow the base of the tower almost entirely. I trudged through it to the shed, my boots sinking deep with each step, the wind trying to push me sideways into the rocks dot inside. I counted the coal, less than I had hoped, though still enough if I remained careful, and checked the barrels of salted fish, which are thankfully still firm and dry. I lingered there a moment before heading back, just to have a roof over my head that wasn't part of the lighthouse, even if only for a few breaths. When I returned to the lantern room in the late afternoon, the horizon was gone again, swallowed by a gray so thick it seemed the world had shrunk to the circle of light spilling from the lamp. I thought of ships then, of crews huddled below deck, listening to the timbers groan, hoping to catch sight of this very glow through the snow. Perhaps one is out there now, steering by instinct, holding on to the belief that somewhere ahead lies safety. The thought made me tend the flame with more care than ever, trimming it until the light shone clear and strong, casting its beam far into the dark. Now, as night deepens, the wind has grown even sharper, carrying fine needles of ice that tap and hiss against the glass. I stand here, the room rocking gently beneath my feet, and feel the old truth of this place settle over me again. The sea will always rage. The wind will always test the stone, but the light must not go out, not while I am its keeper. And so I remain at my post, patient, steadfast, and unblinking, until the first pale light of morning comes to relieve me. It is the 22nd day of February, and the sea has worn itself into a slow but relentless fury, each wave arriving like the measured step of a giant walking in the dark. The air is thick with brine and cold, so cold it seems to press in on the tower from every side, seeping through stone and glass alike, until the very air inside tastes of salt and frost. I rose before first light, as I always do, and found the horizon smothered under a heavy veil of cloud, the kind that does not promise snow, so much as it warns of something older, more patient, lying in wait. In the lantern room, the beam moved steadily through the gloom, cutting swaths into the darkness that the night rushed to fill again. I tend the lamp the way one might tend a sleeping child, with quiet hands and a kind of reverence, knowing that though it asks nothing, it gives everything it can to those who might be searching. I trimmed the wick, cleared the glass, wound the mechanism, and stood with my back to the light, gazing out over the waters that stretch unbroken in every direction. Not a gull, not a sail, not even a curl of smoke betrayed the presence of life beyond this place. Only the sea, the sky, and the sound of the wind threading through the tower's bones. By mid-morning, I braved the weather long enough to climb down to the lowest gallery, the one closest to the rocks, where the spray leaps high enough to strike your face even in calmer seas. Today it was like stepping into the breath of some great beast. A sudden rush of air, cold and wet, had carried with it the sting of salt and the smell of things dredged up from the ocean floor. The rocks below were slick and black, rimmed with ice in strange, jagged shapes, as if the sea had been caught mid-motion and frozen into sculpture. I lingered there, clinging to the railing, letting the sound of the waves drown out every other thought, before climbing back up, my hands stiff on the iron rungs. In the kitchen, I warmed myself with the last of the strong tea leaves, watching the steam curl away into the frigid air as though reluctant to stay. I read from the old logs again, tracing the handwriting of men whose lives were once bound to the same rotations of the lamp, the same endless horizon. One entry from 1872 caught my attention. Saw the phantom light again last night, not too far to be from shore, too steady to be a star. I no longer look for explanations. The words sat heavily in me, stirring that same unease I sometimes feel when the sea grows too quiet. The afternoon passed in a kind of suspended time, the light outside never truly brightening, the wind never truly stilling. I repaired a torn seam in my coat by the stove, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the faint rattle of the lantern room far above. The coal burns lower now, each shovelful used with care, and I find myself calculating how many more storms we might endure before the supply ship arrives. As darkness came on, I climbed once more to the top, the steps cold beneath my boots, the air tightening in my lungs with each breath. I lit the lamp anew, watching its beams sweep out into the encroaching black, knowing it would move like that all night, a patient arm waving to no one I could see. Outside, the wind has begun to rise again, pulling at the gallery railings and making the tower sway ever so slightly, like the slow breathing of something ancient and alive. And here I remain, keeper of this solitary eye in the night, watching over a stretch of water that may never return the favor. The work is quiet, and the hours are long, but I find in them a strange sense of permanence, the feeling that as long as the light is burning, the world has not yet been entirely swallowed by the dark. It is the 26th day of February, and the sea has become a living, breathing wall of sound. From the moment I woke in the narrow bunk, I could feel it, a deep, unbroken rumble that settled into my bones and made the wooden frame of the bed tremble. By the time I climbed the spiral steps to the lantern room, the light was dim and gray, not from the absence of the sun, but from the sheer weight of the clouds pressing down upon the world. The beam from the lamp cut through the haze like a sword through heavy cloth, but the air swallowed it almost immediately, as if the storm was not content to simply surround us, but wanted to devour the very light itself. The wind roared in from the northwest, bringing with it flecks of salt that clung to the glass and left white streaks in the corners. I worked slowly, trimming the wick with deliberate care, feeling the warmth of the flame against my fingers before setting it to turn again, its steady arc slicing the darkness with every passed dot. By mid-morning, I decided to inspect the outer gallery, though I knew the risk of ice. The iron steps leading down were slick, each one treacherous beneath my boots. The moment I opened the outer door, the gale nearly tore it from my hands, and I had to press my full weight against it just to keep my footing. Below, the rocks were invisible beneath a chaos of white spray, the water crashing upward as though determined to claw its way into the tower itself. The air was thick with salt and the scent of something metallic, like rust, and I wondered if the sea had dragged some long-forgotten wreck closer to shore. I lingered only a moment before retreating, my face raw from the cold, my gloves stiff with frozen spray. Back in the kitchen, I lit the stove and poured water into the kettle, the sound of the wind above me, a constant reminder that the world outside was still raging. The afternoon brought no relief. I sat at the desk with a logbook, writing in long, deliberate lines about the weather and the state of supplies. We have enough salted fish for another month if I ration carefully, but the coal has dipped below the level I'd hoped for. The thought of running out before the supply ship returns makes the room feel colder than it already is between entries. I turn to the older logs again, almost as though I were seeking companionship in the words of those who came before. One passage, written in the hand of a keeper from 1859, struck me. There are nights when the wind speaks, and you must listen, though it will not speak in words. I read it over and over until it seemed less like a note in a book, and more like a truth I had always known. As evening fell, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, the kind of color that warns of worse to come. Snow began to drift down, not in gentle flakes, but in heavy clumps that struck the glass and melted into trails of water. I wound the mechanism again, feeling the steady resistance of its gears, the heartbeat of the tower beneath my hand. Outside, the storm seemed to lean in against the walls, testing them, as though the sea itself were knocking to be let in. I stood for a long while at the window, watching the endless rise and fall of the water until it blurred into a single motion, a slow, deep breath drawn by something vast and unseen. And though I know no ship will likely pass tonight, I keep the lamp burning, because that is what the work demands, to shine into the void whether or not anyone is there to see it. Here in this circle of stone and light, I remain as I have for every night before, patient, unyielding, and listening to the voice of the wind, even when it has nothing new to say. It is the second day of March, and the storm that began 2 nights ago has shown no sign of relenting. I woke to the sound of it in the early hours, not the normal bluster of wind and water, but a deeper, more insistent pounding, as if the sea itself had decided to lay siege to the tower. The stones groaned under the weight of each wave that struck, the vibration traveling up through the spiral stairs into the lantern room, where the flames swayed almost imperceptibly, as though bowing to the force outside. I tightened the vents and checked the glass for any sign of cracking. The lamp must not falter. Not now, not when this weather could strip the senses from a sailor in minutes. The horizon is gone, replaced by a shifting wall of gray that blurs the line between sea and sky. Even in daylight, the world feels like it is made of shadows. I spent the morning making my rounds, though they have become little more than rituals now. Checking the coal bin, ensuring the hinges on the heavy doors have not frozen solid, brushing away the thin layers of snow that drift through the smallest cracks. Down in the storeroom, I took stock of the provisions again. The barrels of salted fish are holding, but the flour is dwindling faster than I had hoped. I have begun mixing it with oats to stretch it further. A few stubborn potatoes remain from the last delivery, sprouting pale shoots in the dim light. I turned them over, deciding which I could still save for boiling. The supply ship is weeks away, and I have learned the hard way not to put too much faith in its scheduled dot in the early afternoon. I climbed the narrow stairs back to the lantern room. My breath was loud in my ears, and when I emerged into the cold light, I found the wind had shifted, now striking the tower from the east. The spray reached the highest windows, leaving streaks of white salt that caught the lamplight in strange, fleeting glimmers. I thought of the keepers before me, who must have stood in this same room, in this same posture, watching storms of their own. Some of their entries in the old logs are so brief. Storm continues. Supplies low, as though the words themselves were too heavy to commit in full. Others are oddly poetic, like the one I read yesterday from 1864. The sea knocks without rhythm, the wind sings without tune. Today I feel the truth of that line keenly dot by dusk. The world had taken on a strange coppery hue, the kind that comes when snow and salt mix in the air. The waves below moved with a slow, heavy violence, each one pulling at the rocks as though trying to take them apart. I wound the mechanism again, feeling the smooth resistance of the gears, the quiet strength of the lamp as it turned. The light reached out into nothing, swallowed almost instantly by the weather. Yet I kept it burning, Dot. It is strange, the kind of faith this work demands, to shine for those you cannot see, in conditions that might never let them see you in return. Night has fallen now, though the storm makes it impossible to tell where the day truly ended. The walls of the lantern room creak as the wind presses against them, a steady, testing pressure that feels almost like a hand searching for weakness. The fire in the stove below is burning low, but I will not leave my post until the mechanism has been wound once more. There is a comfort in the repetition, in the way the hours here stretch and fold in on themselves, and in knowing that as long as I stand watch, the light will not fail. Somewhere out there, perhaps unseen, perhaps only imagined, there may be someone steering toward it, Dot, and for that reason alone, I will remain here through the long, unbroken night, listening to the endless voice of the sea. It is the 6th day of March, and I have begun to lose track of how many days the wind has been our constant companion. It no longer comes in gusts or flurries, but in a steady, unbroken force that presses against the tower like a great hand intent on toppling it. When I woke before dawn, the air inside my quarters was colder than it should have been. A thin draft had slipped in through the narrow gap in the shutters, carrying with it the scent of salt and ice. I dressed quickly, my breath misting in the dim light, and climbed the spiral stairs with the familiar weight of my oilskin coat resting across my shoulders. In the lantern room. The glass was already fogged and salted from the night's spray. I took my rag to it, clearing slow circles until the world outside revealed itself. A vast heaving expanse of slate gray, water broken only by the jagged white crests of waves and the swirling flecks of snow that danced like ash above them. The lamp still burned strong, but the flame needed tending, and I trimmed the wick with the care of someone handling a fragile relic. The morning passed in the kind of quiet that is not truly quiet, a constant undercurrent of sound made by wind, water, and the groaning timbers of the tower. I took my tea standing by the window, watching the horizon, if it could be called that, as it shifted in and out of focus beneath the haze-dotted times. The storm opened a brief slit in the distance, enough for me to imagine the faint outline of a ship's mast, though I knew it was only the ghostly shape of a wave. Afterward, I went below to the storeroom to check on the supplies again, not out of necessity, but out of habit. The coal pile is low enough now that each shovelful feels like a small theft from the future. I counted the remaining candles, ran my fingers along the rough grain of the crates, and listened to the muted thud of waves striking the base of the tower. I could feel each impact in my knees, as if I were standing barefoot on the rocks themselves. By mid-afternoon, the storm shifted slightly, the wind curling around from the southeast. Opened a brief slit in the distance, enough for me to imagine the faint outline of a ship's mast, though I knew it was only the ghostly shape of a wave. Afterward, I went below to the storeroom to check on the supplies again, not out of necessity, but out of habit. The coal pile is low enough now that each shovelful feels like a small theft from the future. I counted the remaining candles, ran my fingers along the rough grain of the crates, and listened to the muted thud of waves striking the base of the tower. I could feel each impact in my knees, as if I were standing barefoot on the rocks themselves. By mid-afternoon, the storm shifted slightly, the wind curling around from the under candles. Ran my fingers along the rough grain of the crates and listened to the muted thud of waves striking the base in my knees, as if I were standing barefoot on the rocks themselves. By mid-afternoon, the storm is standing barefoot on the rocks themselves. This brought a change in the light, a faint golden hue diffused through the thick snow, making the lantern room glow as though the day had been dipped in honey dot. It was strange, almost dreamlike, and for a moment I imagined the storm ending suddenly, leaving the sea as calm and flat as a polished mirror. I lingered in that thought longer than I should have before the reality of the weather reasserted itself with another sharp gust, to keep my hands busy. I polished the brass fittings of the mechanism until they gleamed in the lamplight. The repetitive motion brought a kind of peace. The same way the steady ticking of the gears and the slow sweep of the beam have come to lull me into a state between waking and sleep. Night fell abruptly, as it often does here in winter, and the dark seemed heavier than usual. I wound the mechanism again, the sound of its inner workings steady and sure, a heartbeat I have come to rely on. Outside, the sea was invisible now, replaced by a black void into which the light reached again and again, never finding a shore. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, wondering if anyone would see the beam tonight, if there was a soul out there straining their eyes through the snow, waiting for a sign. The thought kept me rooted in place, unwilling to step away from the lantern, even as the hours stretched deep into the night. Here, in this circle of light, I hold my vigil, not because I expect thanks, but because it is what the work demands, and because without it, the dark would simply be allowed to win. It is the 9th day of March, and the world outside the lantern room has been reduced to shades of white, gray, and the occasional glint of steel blue water breaking through the storm's veil. I woke with the sound of the wind in my ears, not as a sharp whistle, but as a low, continuous hum, the kind that vibrates in the walls and makes the glass tremble in its frames. Even before my boots touched the floor, I could feel the tower leaning slightly under the pressure, not enough to alarm, but enough to remind me that the sea always has the final say. When I reached the lantern room, the first thing I noticed was the pattern of frost that had formed overnight across the inside of the glass dot. It looked like a frozen map of rivers and tributaries, branching out in delicate lines that sparkled faintly in the lamp's glow. I ran my glove along the edge of the pane, careful not to disturb too much. It seemed wrong to erase something that had taken the whole night to form. The morning's duties were the same as they always are, though in weather like this, they feel more urgent. I trimmed the wick, checked the oil, and wound the mechanism until it gave that quiet, satisfying click that tells me the beam will make its rounds without interruption. The snow outside moved in thick, swirling sheets, sometimes blinding the view entirely, sometimes parting just enough to reveal the black tips of the rocks far below. The waves struck them with a sound like distant thunder, the spray flying so high that it occasionally reached the lantern windows, even at this height. I made my way down to the lower levels to check the outer doors. The east-facing one had drifted nearly shut with snow, and I had to force it open just enough to clear a narrow path. The cold hit me instantly, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose and settle in my teeth. Out there, the air felt heavier, as though each breath carried the weight of the sea itself. By midday, the storm's rhythm had changed. The gusts came in sudden bursts now, rattling the shutters and sending fine trails of snow through the smallest gaps in the stone. I spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with the old logs again, my fingers tracing the faded ink, as if the touch might conjure the voices of those who wrote them. One entry from 1881 caught my attention. We are alone, but never unseen. There is always something watching from the dark. I read it several times, unsure whether the writer meant it as a comfort or a warning. The thought stayed with me as I boiled water for tea and listened to the soft hiss of the kettle, the only gentle sound in a world otherwise filled with noise. Evening descended slowly, the light bleeding out of the sky, until it was impossible to tell where the snow ended and the night began. I climbed once more to the lantern room, my boots echoing in the narrow stairwell, and found the frost patterns had grown again, twisting into new shapes under the heat of the lamp. The beam continued its patient sweep, cutting across the void, touching nothing, reaching no one, or perhaps someone far beyond what I could see. I stood there for a long time, hands resting on the brass railing, eyes fixed on the black horizon dot. This is the nature of the work, to keep watch when no one is watching you, to send light into a place that will not answer back. And so I keep the flame alive, steady and unblinking, until the storm decides it has tested us enough and moves on. It is the 12th day of March, and the air has taken on that strange, electric stillness that sometimes comes after days of unbroken storm. The wind has dropped, though not entirely, and the sea below moves in slower, heavier breaths, as though it too is tired from the fight. When I woke, the silence was almost unsettling. No rattling shutters, no steady percussion of spray against the glass, only the distant, rolling hiss of waves folding themselves over the rocks. I dressed without hurry, savoring the rare calm, and carried my tea up the spiral steps to the lantern room. The frost that had claimed the glass in recent days had melted into beads of water that caught the morning light, turning the entire room into a kind of quiet prism. The beam moved lazily over the soft horizon, and for the first time in weeks, I could make out the faint outline of the mainland far to the west dot. It was only a shadow, but it felt like seeing the shape of an old friend after a long absence. With the sea momentarily subdued, I took the opportunity to make repairs I had been forced to delay. I checked the ropes in the supply hoist, replaced the worn leather straps on the oil tins, and tightened the bolts on the eastern gallery where the wind has a habit of prying at the railings. The rocks below were slick with a thin skin of ice, but the spray was lighter now, and I could stand there for more than a few breaths without feeling its sting. The air was rich with the scent of salt and seaweed, the latter having washed up in tangled heaps along the base of the tower. I could almost imagine it was late autumn instead of deep winter, were it not for the numbness creeping into my fingertips. The afternoon brought a rare luxury, sunlight. It was pale and fleeting, the kind that makes no promise of warmth, but it streamed in through the lantern room's windows and turned the brass fittings to gold. I opened the logs again, letting the sun fall across the ink of older hands. One entry from 1877 caught my eye. A ship passed close enough to see the faces on deck. They waved. I did not wave back. There was no explanation, no elaboration, just that single quiet confession. I thought about it for a long time, wondering what could keep a man's hand still in that moment. Perhaps it was weariness or pride or the unshakable knowledge that those faces would be gone in seconds, swallowed by the horizon. As the day began to close, I lit the lamp with a steadier hand than usual. The calm outside mirrored in my own movements. The flame caught quickly, and I watched it grow into the familiar, unwavering glow before setting it into motion. The first sweep of the beam stretched far tonight, reaching across water that seemed willing to receive it. I lingered in the lantern room long after my work was done, leaning against the cool glass, watching the last color fade from the sky dot. It is in moments like these, when the sea rests and the air softens, that I feel the weight of the solitude most acutely, not as a burden, but as something vast and empty that I have been entrusted to guard. And so I remain, keeper of the light, waiting for the next storm to test these walls again. It is the 15th day of March, and the calm has begun to fray at the edges. The morning broke with a pale, watery light that spilled across the horizon in thin bands, as though the sun had been hesitant to rise. I stepped into the lantern room and found the glass clear for the first time in over a fortnight. No frost, no salt crust, only the faint residue of yesterday's stillness. The beam's sweep seemed almost lazy in the open air, no longer fighting against the thick wall of snow or spray, but gliding easily over the rippling surface below. The sea, though still, was not quiet. It gave off a constant, low murmur, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Standing there, I felt as if the tower were balanced on the edge of something. Not danger exactly, but a shift, like the deep breath before an answer. I spent most of the morning checking the outer structure. The wooden railings along the gallery had dried stiff and white from days of salt spray. The grain rough beneath my gloves, I found one joint beginning to work itself, loose and tightened it until the metal squealed in protest down at the base. The rocks were slick and dark, the tide pulling back to reveal tangles of kelp that clung like the hair of some great creature beneath the water. The air smelled cleaner than it had in weeks, sharper, as though the storm had scoured it free of all impurities. I lingered longer than I should have, just watching the slow rise and fall of the waves. In the afternoon, clouds began to gather again, thin at first, like smudges on a clean page, then thickening until the light dimmed to the color of pewter. I lit the stove in the kitchen and boiled water for tea, the steam curling upward and fogging the small window. While I waited, I opened the logs once more, flipping to a section from 1890. A keeper had written, "There are days when the light is not for ships, but for me." I understood that line in a way I hadn't before. On days like this, when the sea is calm but the air is heavy with something unspoken, the light feels less like a signal and more like a tether, a proof that I am still here, still tending, still keeping vigil. By evening, the sky had turned to a heavy gray, and the first flakes of snow began to drift down in slow, deliberate spirals. I climbed to the lantern room and lit the lamp, trimming the wick until the flame was steady and golden. Outside, the snow caught in the beam, turning the air into a cascade of falling stars. I stood close to the glass, letting the quiet seep into me, the steady hum of the mechanism, the only sound besides my own breath. It is strange to think how easily this light could be extinguished if I were careless, how quickly the sea would reclaim this place if given the chance. But for now, the lamp turns, the beam sweeps, and the darkness waits, patient as ever. It is the 18th day of March, and the sea has returned to its old habits. The morning came with a muted roar, the kind of sound that seeps into the walls and wakes you before the light does. I dressed quickly, feeling the chill in my bones before I even left my quarters. In the lantern room, the glass was salted once more. A fine white film spread unevenly across the panes. The beam shone through it like light through parchment, diffused but still resolute. Below, the water moved in long, slow swells that carried a hidden weight. Each one struck the rocks with a deep, resonant thud that I felt in the soles of my boots. I began the day's work by tending to the lamp, trimming the wick until the flame stood sharp and bright. The mechanism's gears turned smoothly under my hand, the quiet rhythm of their movement a reassurance against the restlessness outside. I descended to the storage, level to take stock of supplies once more. The coal has dwindled to 2 small heaps, each carefully shaped to stretch as far as they can. The potatoes are gone now, and the oats are nearly finished. I have been relying more on the salted fish and the hard biscuits, though their taste has long since ceased to be anything but functional. There is a strange comfort in this scarcity, the way it narrows your choices until each meal feels like part of the work itself. By midday, the weather shifted again. A sharp wind came from the north, bringing with it a stinging spray that clung to my face and froze along the gallery railing. I made a quick inspection of the tower's base, careful on the slick rocks, and noticed a length of driftwood lodged between two boulders. It was smooth and pale, shaped by years of water into something almost like a twisted spine. I carried it up with me, leaving it beside the stove to dry. Perhaps it will serve as kindling in a week or two, when the coal is nearly gone. The afternoon passed with the slow ticking of the clock in the kitchen and the occasional groan of the tower as it leaned into the wind. I read an entry from 1885 that struck me. Some storms announce themselves. Others arrive in silence and take everything without warning. It made me think of how fragile our presence here truly is. A single man and a flame standing against a sea that does not care for either. Still, when dusk came, I climbed the spiral stairs, lit the lamp, and set it turning. The snow had stopped, but the sky was the color of lead, and the horizon was lost to it. The beam moved in its steady arc, a slow, patient heartbeat against the cold. I watched it for a long while, my hands resting on the railing, knowing that somewhere beyond the darkness, the sea was watching back. It is the 21st day of March, and the sea has taken on that restless character it wears when the seasons begin to shift. The ice along the rocks is thinned, breaking apart into floating shards that clink against one another like fragments of glass. The wind carries the faint scent of something new, not quite spring, but the memory of it, buried somewhere deep in the cold air. I woke, before first light, the tower shuddering in its bones, and made my way to the lantern room with my lamp in hand. Outside, the horizon was a faint smear between the black of the water and the deep charcoal of the sky. I could see the outlines of clouds moving quickly, their shapes torn and scattered like sails in a storm. The day's work began as always with the tending of the light. I trimmed the wick, polished the reflector, and checked the oil level, moving with the deliberate care of someone performing a ritual that must never be rushed. Down below. I took another look at the storeroom, mentally tallying the days the remaining supplies would last. The hard biscuits are now fewer than a dozen, and the salted fish is stacked in its crate like gray bricks. I keep thinking of the supply boat, its last visit already a month behind schedule, and wonder if the sea will grant it passage before April comes. There is a kind of quiet faith in this work, not in anything divine, but in the stubborn belief that someone will come, that the light will remain, and that the tower will still be standing when they arrive. In the afternoon, the wind dropped just enough for me to step out onto the gallery and faced the full breadth of the horizon. The sea was restless, not with high waves, but with constant motion, as though something below the surface stirred uneasily. The sound it made was different today, less of a roar and more of a low, rolling pulse, like the breath of some enormous animal sleeping just beneath the water. I stayed out there longer than I should have, my gloves stiffening from the salt spray, my coat growing heavy. It was difficult to pull myself away, but eventually the cold made the choice for me. Evening came without fanfare. The sky deepened to a heavy blue, and the first faint stars appeared in the gaps between the racing clouds. I climbed once more to the lantern room and lit the lamp, the flame catching with a soft, decisive bloom. The beam swept out across the shifting water, its light sliding over wave crests and vanishing into the black. For a moment, I imagined the light was not just for ships, but for the sea itself, a way of telling it that we were still here, still holding against whatever came next. I lingered in the glow, the hum of the mechanism steady beneath my hands, until the night settled fully and the tower became, once again, an island of light in an endless dark. It is the 24th day of March, and the morning began with the faintest suggestion of warmth in the air. Not much, barely enough to notice, but different enough that I felt at the moment. I stepped from my quarters. The light coming through the narrow windows was softer, almost hesitant, and the sea outside had taken on a dull pewter sheen from the lantern room. I watched as the horizon appeared and disappeared in the low clouds, a slow, patient game the sky and water have played for centuries. The glass here was wet with condensation rather than frost, tiny droplets clinging like seeds to the clear surface. I ran my fingers along them absent-mindedly as I listened to the low murmur of the gears turning the lamp. The morning tasks felt slower today, not because I moved sluggishly, but because each action seemed to hold its own weight. I trimmed the wick, the scissors making their small, precise snips in the quiet, and then polished the brass fittings until they reflected the faint light. Down in the supply room, I counted the days of coal left, perhaps 10, if I was sparing, and thought of how the nights might feel without the stove's constant heartbeat. I found myself looking again at the driftwood I'd brought in days ago, now dry and pale, its twisted shape almost skeletal. It would burn quickly, but it seemed wrong to use it just yet. By midday, the clouds thickened into a blanket of dull silver, and the wind rose from the southeast, bringing with it the smell of wet rope and distant rain. I took my oilskin coat and walked the outer gallery, checking each section of railing. Sea below was a restless thing, the swells overlapping and sliding over one another without order, as though some unseen hand stirred the entire expanse. The sound of it reached up in uneven breaths, sometimes soft enough to vanish under the whistle of the wind, sometimes loud enough to rattle the teeth of the tower itself. In the late afternoon, I allowed myself the luxury of reading from the older logs again. One entry from 1869 caught me off guard. There are days when the light feels less like a duty and more like a confession. I read that line several times, trying to decide what the writer meant. A confession of what? Of loneliness? Of the desire to be seen? Or perhaps it was the acknowledgement that the act of keeping the light, of sending it out into the night, is itself an admission that we cannot bear to vanish entirely into darkness. Evening came with the slow dimming of the sky, the sea now the color of ink spilled over tin. I climbed to the lantern room and lit the lamp, watching the flame bloom and catch, its glow reflected in every drop of water clinging to the glass. The beams swept out into the gathering dark, each turn a slow heartbeat, each flash a reminder that the tower still breathes. I stood there for a long while, my hands resting against the cool brass, listening to the mechanism's quiet pulse until the night fully claimed the horizon. Out here, in the space between sea and sky, the light is the only truth I have left, and for now, it is enough. It is the 27th day of March, and the air has turned heavy with the scent of rain before the storm. I woke to the low, steady beat of the waves against the rocks, not violent yet, but purposeful, like the first drum beats before a march. The sky outside was the color of slate, a thick and unbroken sheet that stretched from horizon to horizon. In the lantern room, the glass was streaked with early moisture, each droplet trembling slightly in the wind before sliding down to join the rest. The beam carved through it all without hesitation, its pale arc sweeping across the shifting water like a watchful eye. The morning work began in silence. I trimmed the wick, the blade making that small, satisfying whisper as it cut through the char. I checked the oil and topped it just enough to last the day, the scent of it sharp in the enclosed space down in the storage room. I measured the coal again, 9 days left, perhaps less if the weather turns colder. The biscuits now number only 8, their edges hard as stone, and the salted fish is beginning to carry a sharper odor than before. I've begun to eat more slowly, not out of caution, but because the act itself feels like a way to mark the passing of time. By midday, the first drops of rain began to fall, striking the gallery rail with a sound like small, hurried footsteps. The sea shifted in color, darkening until it matched the sky, the line between the two nearly gone. The wind was rising now, threading itself through the gallery like an invisible rope pulling at my coat. I walked the perimeter, testing each section of railing, tightening the bolts where the metal had begun to loosen under the constant assault of salt and wind. The spray climbed higher today, and twice I had to step back to avoid being struck full in the face. In the afternoon, I found an entry in the logs from 1872. When the storms come, the tower does not resist. It leans, it breathes, it sings in the wind. I read it while the rain began to lash harder against the windows, and I realized that I could hear it, that deep, resonant hum that runs through the stones when the wind reaches the right pitch. It's not a sound you notice immediately, but once you hear it, you understand that the tower is alive in its own way, speaking to the sea in a language older than both of us. Evening descended without a sunset, the light simply draining from the world until all that remained was the deep, endless gray of a storm's eye. I climbed to the lantern room and lit the lamp, the flame catching easily despite the dampness in the air. The beams swept into the rain, scattering in soft halos around each droplet, turning the storm into something almost gentle from this height. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool brass of the mechanism, listening to the tower's low song as the wind pressed against it. Out here, in this weather, the light is not just a guide, it is a defiance. A single, unblinking star in a sky determined to erase all others. It is the 30th day of March, and the storm that began 2 days ago has not yet loosened its grip. The sea below moves with the weight of something ancient, each swell rising high enough to shroud the base of the tower in a curtain of white spray. The air itself feels thick, as though the wind has woven salt and moisture into every breath. From the lantern room, the horizon is nowhere to be found. The world has been reduced to a restless expanse of dark water and the occasional pale flash of a breaking wave. The beam cuts through it in slow, deliberate sweeps, its light swallowed quickly, as though the storm resents its presence. The morning began with a steady thrum of rain against the glass, not the sharp, staccato patter of a passing shower, but a constant, heavy drumming that seemed to come from all directions at once. I trimmed the wick carefully, watching the charred edge fall away in small, curled fragments. The lamp's glow felt warmer than usual against the dimness of the room, and I lingered there a moment longer before beginning the rest of my work. Down in the storage room, I found the coal heap noticeably smaller. 7 days now if I stretch it. The biscuits are down to 6, each one chipped at the corners from handling, and the fish has grown saltier with every meal. I ration without thinking now. It has become as natural as breathing. By midday, the wind rose again, turning the rain into something sharper, like thousands of tiny needles striking every surface. I stepped out onto the gallery only briefly, long enough to check the condition of the railing. The spray caught me almost instantly, running down the back of my neck and chilling my spine. I could hear the sea far below, its voice muffled by the roar of the wind, but every so often a deeper crash rose above the rest, the unmistakable sound of a wave striking the rocks with its full weight. The tower swayed subtly with each blow, not in weakness, but in the way a tree bends with the wind, so as not to break Dot in the late afternoon. I found myself drawn again to the logbooks, to a page from 1881. It is not the storms that undo us, but the quiet that comes after. I thought about those words for a long time, wondering if they were meant as a warning or a confession. Perhaps both. Out here, storms bring clarity. You know what you're fighting. You know what must be done. But when the sea calms and the air stills, it leaves room for the mind to wander. And sometimes that wandering can be the most dangerous weather of all. Night came without ceremony, the clouds above so thick that darkness fell as though someone had closed a great curtain over the world. I lit the lamp and set it turning, the beam pushing out into the rain, breaking it into soft halos that shimmered before vanishing. I stayed in the lantern room long after the mechanism had settled into its steady rhythm, listening to the wind rush past, feeling the faint, constant tremor of the stones beneath my boots. In this moment, the tower feels less like a building and more like a companion, one that breathes with me, that endures with me, that will keep standing long after my watch is over. And so we face the night together, the light and I, holding our place in a world determined to swallow us whole. It is the second day of April, and the storm has finally passed, leaving behind a sea that seemed exhausted from its own fury. The swells are still high, but their movements are slower now, less urgent, as though each wave is taking a long breath before collapsing into the rocks. The air is crisp and clean, the salt sharp in my nostrils, and the horizon has returned at last, a thin, unbroken line that feels almost foreign after days of nothing but gray. From the lantern room, the beam moves easily now, unimpeded by rain or mist, its light stretching farther than I have seen in weeks. The morning began with the soft drip of water from the gallery roof, the sound of melting frost, and the last remnants of rain finding their way down the sides of the tower. I stepped outside into a pale, hesitant sunlight, the stones beneath my boots still slick from the storm. The wind had dropped to little more than a whisper, and for the first time in days I could hear the smaller sounds again, the faint creak of the railing, the distant cries of seabirds returning from wherever they had sheltered, the slow, rhythmic lap of water against the rocks. It felt like waking from a fever dream, where the silence itself becomes the most disorienting thing of all. I began my work slowly, almost reluctantly, as though breaking the stillness would undo it. The wick needed trimming, though only slightly, and I polished the reflector until it shone so brightly I could see my own tired reflection staring back at me down in the storage room. The coal is now at 6 days' worth, perhaps 5 if the nights turn colder. The biscuits have dwindled to 4, and the salted fish grows leaner with every meal. I found myself staring at the empty sacks and crates longer than necessary, not because I expected them to refill, but because they seemed to mark the quiet passage of time more than any clock could dot. By midday, I ventured farther along the rocks than I had in weeks. The tide was low, and the pools left behind held fragments of the storm, torn kelp, shells shattered into fine white dust, and pieces of driftwood bleached almost bone white. I found a feather lodged between two stones, its edges frayed by the wind, and tucked it into my coat pocket. I'm not sure why. Perhaps just to have something that came from the air rather than the sea dot in the afternoon. I read another log entry from 1892. After the storm, the silence comes to see if we are still here. I felt the truth of that line in every corner of the tower today. The stillness was not comforting. It was watchful, almost expectant, as if waiting for me to prove that I could endure it as well as I endured the storm. When evening arrived, the sky turned the color of deep amber, streaked with violet where the last of the clouds drifted apart. I climbed to the lantern room and lit the lamp, the flame catching quickly in the dry-aired dot. The beam swept out over the calm, unbroken surface of the sea, and for the first time in days it felt less like a warning and more like a welcome. A soft hand reaching out across the water dot. I stayed there until the stars began to appear one by one, each one reflected in the dark water below, as though the sky had dropped its jewels into the sea dot in the quiet. I realized that this was the real work, not just surviving the storms, but keeping the light burning in the long, watchful silences that follow. It is the 5th day of April, and the air feels warmer today, though the warmth is of a muted kind, the sort that carries more promise than reality. The sea has calmed further still, the swells reduced to long, rolling breaths that rise and fall without urgency. The gulls have returned in greater number now, their cries wheeling high above the tower, occasionally dipping close enough that their shadows slide over the stone like fleeting ghosts. From the lantern room, the horizon is a crisp, unbroken line, the sky above pale and clean, almost translucent in its clarity. The beam travels so far that it feels, for a moment, as though it could touch the edge of the world. The morning began with a strange stillness inside the tower. Not silence, for there is always the soft groan of the structure and the faint whir of the mechanism, but a stillness of movement, as though even the air itself was content to remain where it was. I trimmed the wick, the char falling into the tray below like black petals, and then polished the glass until the last smudges from the storm were gone. The light reflected back at me so clearly that it felt as if I were standing inside a second lantern, one made entirely of mirrored air, down in the storage room. The coal remains at 5 days, perhaps 6 if I am careful. The biscuits are 3 now, each one a little harder than the last, and the fish is nearly gone. I find my appetite shrinking with the rations, not from hunger, but from the slow discipline of making each bite last as long as possible. By midday, I decided to walk the circumference of the gallery twice, letting my boots fall in the same steady rhythm as the turning of the lamp. From up there, the sea looked almost harmless, its surface catching the light in small, fractured flashes. But I have been here long enough to know that such gentleness is only a disguise, a brief interlude in a story that is always ready to turn violent again. I leaned against the railing, feeling the faint sway of the tower beneath me, the movement so subtle it could be mistaken for my own breathing dot in the afternoon. I returned to the logbooks. I found an entry from 1875. It is not the days that weigh on a man here, but the hours between them. That line stayed with me as I prepared the lamp for the night, the truth of it resonating in the quiet between each task. Out here, the hours seem to stretch and fold in on themselves, becoming indistinguishable until only the rituals, the tending of the light, the crowding of the mechanism, the counting of supplies, give them shape. Evening descended in a slow, graceful fade, the sky turning from pale gold to a deep, soft blue before the first stars appeared. I lit the lamp, watching the flame bloom and settle into its steady, unwavering glow. The beam swept out across the calm sea, touching the surface in silver arcs that disappeared into the dark. I stayed there, my hand resting on the warm brass of the mechanism, feeling the steady heartbeat of the tower beneath my palm. It is on nights like this, with the sea so still and the air so clear, that the isolation feels less like a burden and more like a rare kind of freedom, the freedom to exist quietly and without question, in a place where the only measure of time is the turning of the light.